Hi, I'm Steve Levine and welcome to my studio. So the history of Vox. I purchased my first Vox amp when I was still at school. I think I was 16, maybe 15 or 16. And we went to a school boot fair or fete and there was one there for sale. I can't remember exactly how much it was, but it wasn't fully working. Luckily, I went to a technical school as a sixth former and we had a fantastic electronics teacher, Mr. Page. So between he and I, we managed to get it to work. But it was very much the sound. In those days, we were kind of in the glam rock, and if you ever looked at Top of the Pops, the Vox amp was very much there. When I then started work in recording studios, this was around 1975 when I started, it was the transition from the kind of rock era into the new punk era. And virtually every band that we ever worked with in the studio, CBS Studios, had a Vox AC30. That was the amp. And I have great memories of bands like the Jags, for example, and John Alder, Vox AC30. In fact, they had multiple AC30s. And even when we worked with the Clash, the band setup included an AC30. And it was probably, if I recall exactly, I think Joe Strummer's original rhythm guitars was AC30. We certainly did different amps when we did overdubs, but I think the tracking definitely included that. And it became very much, as a record producer, in my mind, the trademark sound of that era. And then as we moved to the 80s, amplifier technology really changed. And it's fair to say, I think most valve amps probably kind of moved to the background for a bit. But what kept the Vox relevant, I think, was it coincided with the start of all of these strange effects, a lot of studio outboard equipment. And very often one would use the clean sound of the AC30 and then add on the chorus effects or any of the sort of digital delays that were very much available then. And I think a lot of 80s records that have that kind of chorusy delayed sound used a lot of those elements. There were other amps that were used as well, but certainly if you wanted that kind of clean, chimey sound. And very often you'd work with a band and they'd want to use an esoteric guitar. For example, a 12-string, and that chimey sound is absolutely delivered every time. So that's kind of my brief history. I've always owned Vox amps, and in my studio here today, a ton of them. I think the Vox amp series has three kind of trademark sounds, and those are really prevalent on so many records. In fact, they're really distinctive sounds. So for example, the vibe or tremolo sound which the amp creates, that's kind of where the volume amplifiers. That sound very dominant on some Beatles records, on The Shadows, and a lot of early 60s records, they use that sound. It was one of the first amps that had a great built-in reverb, and if you remember back again to say The Shadows, the sound of that reverb is absolutely part of Hank Marvin's trademark signature guitar sound, and very much on some of the Beatles records. As you move through the 60s and more guitars started to become available, what everyone calls the chimey sound. Now that's because the Vox amp, and this is probably the second of the trademark sounds, it has this kind of glass, shimmery, very bright, but very clean sound. And that's on so many records. And just for those technically minded, the kind of trademark chimey sound on the Vox amp is referred to as what they call top boost. And top boost is this separate circuit that has this additional sound. And particularly actually if you layer the guitar and you have different octaves of the guitar, having that top boost really helps the kind of lower tones cut through. And actually as we move towards the 70s, a lot of that kind of super hi-fi sound is very much the sound of that amp. It's important to remember also that microphone technology changed throughout the 60s and 70s. And actually, when you listen to records in the 70s that were cut using the Vox amp, it's the fact that the microphone technology had improved so much that you get even more of that sound. And then I guess the third trademark sound is this crunchy distortion that you can get. Now, that's often achieved sometimes with a pedal at the front, and there are countless examples of fuzz tones and distortion pedals at the front of a Vox amp that create that. But the amp itself does have this great trick where you can do two things. You can have the preamp loud and pull the volume down, so you're kind of overdriving the front end. You can also, with a jack plug on the AC30, actually kind of parallel up the two inputs. That's a trick that so many producers use. It's a great sound because then you get the sort of fat tone and the kind of chimey sound. So I guess those are the three trademark sounds that the amp is capable of, and literally every record you work on, you need, if not all three, certainly one or two of those sounds. I've been so lucky. I've worked with Gary Moore, one of the greatest guitarists of all time. So much of his sound is the way that he interacts with the amp. I remember him doing an overdub for me at my house where he bought this little tiny amp, but it still sounded like Gary Moore because it's the way that he interacts. So having that conversation with the guitarist about what they want to listen to when they overdub is really, really crucial, because having the right tone is incredibly inspirational. On some of the tracks we've worked with, when you get a fuzz tone that is just to die for, it's just the best fuzz tone. I sincerely believe, and I think my guitarist backed me up in that, you're playing with this tone, it's inspirational. That's the difference. So my studio house amp, if you were, is the AC10 C1X. Now, the reason I chose that one is that that one has the blue Anlico speaker, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly. I chose that one because that to me has the most universal tone, because I'm also working with a lot of different bands, so I have to be kind of flexible. What I also added to mine was I added an external speaker, so actually I can run two speakers off the same amp. But that's my kind of house amp, my go-to amp. Absolutely, that gets plugged in first. So here's an interesting thing. I've found through some of the guitarists I've worked with, especially somebody like Gary Moore, that sometimes you don't need a massive speaker to get that big sound. You can actually achieve a really great lead sound with a smaller amp. Makes it much easier to record as well, and easier to mic. And the guitarist can get, more feedback if they're sitting really close to it. So the AC10 C1 is probably the go-to amp for that. To my left here is probably the most famous AC30 of all time. It's got two 12-inch speakers in it, and those are the famous greenback speakers. So this model is the AC30 C2, and really kind of is, the sound of so many great records, and it's so loud that it can work in a pub without any PA. It's really, really loud. Sometimes probably even a bit too loud for a studio, but often you can run it lower and put a pedal at the front. Having the two speakers is fabulous because you can mic them with two different mics if you want a slightly different sound, or the same mics if you're lucky enough to have a pair. But you can do some great tricks with the tone, because if you have two mics, you can kind of move them around and get some phase cancelling, which can sometimes give you, particularly, if you want that kind of, that sort of mid-70s kind of glam rock sound, you can definitely get that by having a bit of phase cancellation. You get that kind of ox sound. A lot of guitarists of that era used to do it with a half-open wah-wah pedal. It's, a lot of the David Bowie records have that kind of sound. It's very kind of in your face, very middly, and you can do that by moving the mics around if you've got two speakers. It's very easy to do and quite a pleasing sound. If you're working on something that wants a lot of low end, then a single speaker can be really, really good. It's very focused, and this is the one to go. So here we have the AC30 S1. That gives you all the power, but with one single Celestion VX12 speaker in it. So sometimes when you're working with a band or a session player, they want to play in the control room, but they also want the amp in the control room, which is obviously impossible. But a head is a great compromise, because it means you can run the head in the control room and get the tone. Because if I'm using something like this in the studio and the guitarist is playing in the control room, I have to run in, set the sound, and we kind of go, yes, no, run back in and go, a bit more, move the mics. The advantage of having a head in the control room is that you can both adjust the tone together, and all you've got in the studio is just a speaker with the microphone. The other neat trick that this has, which some of the smaller amps often have, is it's got an attenuating switch. I'm clicking it now. And what that does is you can run the amp at much lower power, but still get that kind of crunch and front end push that you need. So having a head in the control room is a great gift. If you can possibly afford to do it, it's the way to go. And the other thing is, if I do that, you can hear that the head has got the spring in it, and it's got a full-size spring, which is also great if you've got synthesizers and drum machines, because you can now have spring reverb in the control room with full control. The only thing you need to do is make sure you have the right box to go into the front end of here, so it's the perfect level. but you'll be rewarded with the greatest dub sounds ever by plugging into the spring reverb here.
Oh, that's great. That's really good. That was perfect. One more take. Great sound though. Here we go again. One more take for luck.